Have you ever felt overlooked? Like your story wasn't important enough to be told? Today, we're uncovering one of the Bible's most fascinating mysteries, a story that will forever change how you see your purpose in God's plan. It's the untold tale of Moses' sons, Gershom and Eliezer, and their disappearance from the pages of history. You know Moses, the legendary prophet who confronted Pharaoh, parted the Red Sea, and received the 10 Commandments. His name echoes through history as one of the greatest leaders who ever lived. But what about his own flesh and blood? What happened to his sons? Why did they seem to vanish from the biblical narrative? The answer reveals a profound truth about God's purpose that speaks directly to anyone who's ever felt invisible. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why these sons of the greatest prophet in Jewish history seem to fade into the background. You'll learn about a shocking incident that almost cost Moses his life, why God intentionally kept his sons from the spotlight, and how their legacy continues to impact us today in ways you never imagined. Most importantly, you'll understand why their story matters so much for your own journey of faith. But first, we need to journey back to where it all began, in the land of Midian. Picture this. Moses, once a prince of Egypt with access to all its power and luxury, is now a fugitive. He had fled after killing an Egyptian taskmaster who was beating a Hebrew slave. Everything he had known, his identity, his position, his future, was stripped away in a moment. In this foreign land, among people who didn't know his royal background, Moses began a new life that would shape not only his future, but the destiny of his children. It was here in Midian that Moses met Zipporah, daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian. Their marriage would produce 2 sons whose names tell us something remarkable about Moses' spiritual journey and God's profound work in his life. These weren't just any names. They were declarations of faith, testimonies to God's faithfulness in the midst of displacement and uncertainty. First came Gershom. Exodus 2:22 tells us that Moses named him Gershom because, as he said, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." Think about the weight of that name. Gershom, literally meaning a stranger there. Every time Moses called his firstborn son's name, he was remembering his own exile, his own journey from palace to wilderness. This wasn't just a name. It was a testimony to how God often shapes us through our seasons of displacement and uncertainty. But there's something even more profound here. Moses, who had grown up in Pharaoh's palace with all its luxury and power, was now identifying himself as a sojourner, a temporary resident in a foreign land. This name choice reveals Moses' deep spiritual transformation. The man who once belonged in Egypt's royal courts was now embracing his identity as one who belonged nowhere in this world, except in God's purpose. Then came Eliezer, whose name means, "My God is help." Exodus 18:4 records Moses saying, "The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." This name was a declaration of divine protection, a testament to God's faithfulness even when Moses was running for his life. Together, these names tell a story of loss and divine provision, of exile and heavenly help. They reveal how God was working in Moses' life even before his great calling at the burning bush. These names carry a message that resonates with anyone who's ever felt displaced or dependent on God's help. Maybe you're in a season where nothing feels familiar, where you're far from where you thought you'd be. Or perhaps you're experiencing God's help in ways you never expected. The names of Moses' sons remind us that these experiences aren't detours from God's plan. They're often the very paths He uses to shape us for His purpose. But it's what happened next that would mark a crucial turning point in their family's story. As Moses prepared to return to Egypt to fulfill God's calling to deliver the Israelites, he took his wife and sons with him. This should have been the beginning of their prominence in Israel's story. After all, they were the children of the man God had chosen to lead His people to freedom. They had a front-row seat to one of the greatest divine interventions in history. Yet something happened on that journey that would shake their family to its core. Exodus 4:24-26 records one of the most mysterious and dramatic moments in Scripture. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. The text tells us that Zipporah quickly took a flint knife and circumcised their son, touching Moses' feet with the foreskin and saying, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." This shocking incident reveals something crucial about divine calling and obedience. Moses, who was about to demand Pharaoh's obedience to God's commands, had neglected to obey the fundamental covenant sign of circumcision for his own son. It was Zipporah's swift action that saved Moses' life, but this event marked a turning point. Shortly after this, Moses' family disappears from the main narrative of the Exodus story. Why is this significant? Because it shows us that even the greatest spiritual leaders face moments of personal failure and correction. Moses, who would become known as the most faithful servant in God's house, had to learn obedience through this near-fatal encounter. It reminds us that God's purposes often unfold through our weaknesses and failures, not just our strengths. This incident gives us our first clue about why Moses' sons seem to fade from prominence. While we might expect them to inherit their father's prophetic mantle or assume leadership roles in Israel, God had a different plan. Unlike Aaron's sons, who would later become high priests, Gershom and Eliezer's story takes a different turn. Their path wouldn't lead to the spotlight of leadership, but to something equally vital in God's plan. The next chapter in their story challenges everything we think we know about success, influence, and divine purpose. It reveals how God often works most powerfully not through positions of prominence, but through faithful service in the background. But before we uncover that part of their journey, we need to understand what happened to Moses' family after that dramatic night at the lodging place. After the life-threatening encounter at the lodging place, the biblical narrative takes an unexpected turn that reveals something profound about how God works in our lives. Moses made a difficult decision that would shape the future of his sons and teach us something crucial about divine purpose. He sent his wife and sons back to Midian, to his father-in-law Jethro's house. This separation wasn't just a minor family matter. Moses was about to confront Pharaoh and lead one of the greatest divine interventions in history. He was stepping into the fullness of his calling, but his sons wouldn't be by his side to witness it. Think about that for a moment. The very children who could have had front-row seats to the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, and the delivery of the Ten Commandments, were instead living quietly in Midian. We next encounter Moses' family after the Exodus from Egypt, after the crossing of the Red Sea. Exodus 18:5 tells us, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. When this reunion happened, Moses had already established himself as God's chosen prophet. The Israelites had witnessed unprecedented miracles through his leadership. The manna was falling from heaven, and God's presence was visibly manifesting in the pillar of cloud and fire. But notice something fascinating. While all these monumental events were unfolding, Gershom and Eliezer weren't part of them. They missed the dramatic confrontations with Pharaoh. They weren't there when the sea parted. They didn't witness the daily miracles of God's provision in the wilderness. Instead, they were being prepared for a different kind of service, a different kind of calling. This brings us to a crucial contrast in the biblical narrative. While Moses' sons were living in relative obscurity in Midian, their cousins, the sons of Aaron, were being positioned for prominent roles in Israel's spiritual leadership. God specifically chose Aaron and his sons for the priesthood, as recorded in Exodus 28:1. Have Aaron your brother brought to you from among the Israelites, along with his sons Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, so they may serve me as priests. The distinction between these two family lines, the sons of Moses and the sons of Aaron, reveals something profound about God's purposes. Aaron's sons were given visible positions of spiritual authority. They would wear special garments, perform the sacred rituals, and stand as mediators between God and the people. They would be at the center of Israel's worship, visible to all, carrying out the most sacred duties of the tabernacle service. But with this prominence came grave responsibility and serious risk. In one of the most sobering passages in Scripture, we read about what happened to Aaron's eldest sons. Leviticus 10:1-2 records, Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu took their censers, put fire in them and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. This tragic event carries a powerful message about the nature of spiritual prominence. Being in the spotlight isn't always a blessing. Sometimes positions of high visibility bring greater danger, greater accountability, and greater potential for devastating failure. This is where the story of Moses' sons takes on new significance. While their cousins were serving in the prestigious role of priests, with all its visibility and honor, and all its risks, Gershom and Eliezer were being prepared for a different kind of service. They would become part of the larger body of Levites, those chosen to support the work of the tabernacle, and, later, the temple. This wasn't a lesser calling, it was a different one, equally vital in God's plan. 1 Chronicles 23:14-17 gives us a fascinating glimpse into their legacy. The sons of Moses, the man of God, were counted as part of the tribe of Levi. The sons of Moses, Gershom and Eliezer. The descendants of Gershom, Shebuel was the first. The descendants of Eliezer, Rehabiah was the first. Eliezer had no other sons, but the sons of Rehabiah were very numerous. This passage might seem like a simple genealogy, but it reveals something remarkable. While Moses' sons didn't inherit their father's prophetic mantle or take on visible leadership roles, they established lasting legacies through their descendants. Shebuel, Gershom's descendant, would later become a trusted overseer of the treasuries, while Rehabiah's line became very numerous, a sign of God's blessing and favor. The implications of this are profound. The sons of the greatest prophet in Israel's history found their purpose not in matching their father's fame, but in faithful service behind the scenes. They didn't part any seas or receive divine law on mountaintops, but their contributions were essential to Israel's worship and spiritual life. This challenges everything we think we know about success and significance. In our world of social media influence and constant visibility, we often equate importance with public recognition. But God's economy of purpose works differently. Sometimes the most significant contributions to His kingdom happen in the quiet, unseen moments of faithful service. Consider how this played out in the daily life of Israel. While the priests performed the visible ceremonies and sacrifices, the Levites, including the descendants of Moses' sons, maintained the infrastructure of worship. They cared for the sacred vessels, maintained the temple grounds, assisted in the sacrificial system, and preserved the integrity of worship. Without their faithful service, the more visible ministries couldn't have functioned. This is where we find a powerful truth for our own lives. Just as Gershom and Eliezer found their purpose in supporting roles rather than leading roles, God often calls us to serve in ways that don't draw attention to ourselves. These seemingly minor roles are actually essential parts of His greater plan. But there's something even more fascinating about the legacy of Moses' sons that we need to explore. Remember Shebuel, the descendant of Gershom we mentioned earlier? 1 Chronicles 26:24 tells us something remarkable about him. Shebuel, a descendant of Moses' son Gershom, was the chief officer in charge of the treasuries. This wasn't just any administrative position. This was a role that required tremendous trust, integrity, and wisdom. Think about what this means. While Moses' sons didn't inherit their father's prophetic office, their line produced leaders who were entrusted with the resources of God's house. The treasuries they managed weren't just material wealth. They included the sacred vessels used in worship, the tithes and offerings of the people, and the resources needed for maintaining the temple service. This was a position of enormous responsibility, even if it didn't come with the public acclaim of prophecy or priesthood. And then there's that intriguing detail about Eliezer's line, that the sons of Rehabiah were very numerous. In Hebrew culture, having numerous descendants was seen as a clear sign of God's blessing. Remember God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 22:17, "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore." The multiplication of Eliezer's line through Rehabiah was a living testament to God's faithfulness. This reveals something crucial about how God works. While the world focuses on individual achievement and personal fame, God often measures success differently. The legacy of Moses' sons wasn't found in personal acclaim or individual accomplishments, but in the multiplication of faithful servants across generations. Their impact wasn't measured in moments of dramatic intervention like their fathers, but in the steady, faithful service of countless descendants. Consider Shebuel's role as treasurer. In our modern context, this might seem like a mundane administrative position, certainly not as exciting as being a prophet or priest. But think about the impact of his service. Every sacrifice offered, every festival celebrated, every act of worship in the temple depended on the faithful management of resources he oversaw. His behind-the-scenes service made the visible ministry possible. And what about Rehabiah's numerous descendants? They represent something powerful about how God multiplies influence. Instead of concentrating spiritual power in one charismatic leader, God often spreads his influence through many faithful servants. Each of Rehabiah's descendants had their own sphere of influence, their own opportunity to impact others for God's kingdom. Together, they likely influenced more lives than a single prominent leader could have reached. This brings us to another fascinating aspect of their story: the timing of God's purpose. Notice that the prominence of Moses' descendants through Shebuel came generations after Moses himself. This teaches us something vital about divine timing. Sometimes the seeds we plant in faithfulness don't bear their full fruit in our lifetime. Moses might never have seen how his sons' lines would contribute to Israel's worship, but God was working out his purpose across generations. The role of Moses' descendants in the Levitical service teaches us something crucial about the nature of spiritual influence. While the priests performed the visible sacrifices, the Levites, including Moses' descendants, maintained the entire infrastructure of worship. They were responsible for teaching the law, maintaining the sacred spaces, preparing the sacrificial elements, and preserving the integrity of worship. This division of spiritual labor reveals God's wisdom in building his kingdom. Not everyone is called to be at the forefront, but every role is essential. Just as a modern church needs both preachers and administrators, both worship leaders and childcare workers, the ancient temple required both priests and Levites. Each role was different, but each was vital to the overall purpose of glorifying God and serving his people. Consider how this challenges our modern understanding of spiritual gifts and calling. We often elevate certain gifts, teaching, prophecy, leadership, while minimizing others. But the story of Moses' sons shows us that God values faithful service in every capacity. Their legacy wasn't built on spectacular displays of power, but on consistent, reliable service in the roles God assigned them. This brings us to a powerful truth about divine purpose. God often works most effectively through a multitude of faithful servants, rather than a few prominent leaders. Think about it. While everyone knows Moses' name, it was through his sons' descendants that God established a lasting legacy of service in Israel. Their story teaches us that impact isn't always about individual achievement. Sometimes it's about becoming part of a larger story of faithful service across generations. The implications of this for our own spiritual journey are profound. Maybe you've struggled with feeling insignificant because your role doesn't draw attention. Perhaps you've wondered if your service matters when it's not seen or celebrated by others. The legacy of Moses' sons reminds us that God sees and values every act of faithful service, whether it's in the spotlight or behind the scenes. But there's more to their story that speaks directly to our modern struggles with purpose and significance. Consider how their journey challenges our contemporary obsession with instant success and visible achievement. In a world of viral videos and overnight sensations, the steady, generations-long impact of Moses' sons offers a different model of influence. Their story also teaches us something vital about the relationship between greatness and service. Moses, their father, was called the most humble man on earth. His sons and their descendants continued this legacy of humble service, finding their purpose not in seeking prominence but in supporting the work of God's kingdom. This challenges our natural desire for recognition and reminds us that true greatness in God's kingdom often looks very different from worldly success. So what does all of this mean for us today? Why does the story of Moses' sons matter so much in our modern world? The answer lies in understanding how their story intersects with our own struggles, hopes, and questions about purpose and significance. Their journey from apparent obscurity to lasting impact holds powerful lessons that are perhaps more relevant now than ever before. Let's start with a truth that might be hard to hear. God's greatest work in your life might not look anything like what you expected. Think about Gershom and Eliezer. As sons of Moses, they might have grown up expecting to inherit their father's prophetic mantle. They had a front-row seat to some of the most spectacular miracles in biblical history. Yet God had a completely different plan for their lives, one that seemed less dramatic but was equally vital to His purposes. This speaks directly to our modern struggle with expectations and calling. Maybe you grew up dreaming of doing great things for God. Perhaps you imagined yourself leading massive revivals, starting influential ministries, or making headlines with your faith. But instead you find yourself serving in ways that seem small and unremarkable. The story of Moses' sons reminds us that God's definition of significance often looks very different from our own. Consider this powerful truth revealed in 1 Corinthians 12:22-23. The parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and on those parts of the body that we think less honorable we bestow the greater honor. This perfectly describes the legacy of Moses' sons. While they might have seemed less honored than their priestly cousins, their service was indispensable to Israel's worship. Without the faithful work of the Levites, including their descendants, the more visible ministries of the priests couldn't have functioned. But there's an even deeper lesson here about how God builds His kingdom. In Matthew 13:31-32, Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed, something that starts tiny but grows into something much larger. The legacy of Moses' sons follows this pattern. What began as two sons who seemed to fade into the background grew into generations of faithful servants who played crucial roles in Israel's spiritual life. This challenges our modern obsession with immediate results and instant impact. We live in a world of viral videos and overnight sensations, where success is often measured in views, likes, and shares. But God's timeline for significance often works differently. The most lasting impact usually comes through patient, faithful service that may not show its full fruit in our lifetime. Look at what Proverbs 22:29 tells us. Do you see someone skilled in their work? They will serve before kings, they will not serve before officials of low rank. This principle played out in the life of Shebuel, Gershom's descendant. His rise to a position of trust and responsibility didn't come through seeking the spotlight, but through faithful excellence in whatever task was before him. This principle still holds true today. God often elevates those who prove faithful in unseen service. And what about Rehabiah's numerous descendants? Their story teaches us about the power of generational impact. While one prominent leader might influence many people for a season, a line of faithful servants can impact generations. This challenges us to think beyond our individual legacy, to consider how our faithfulness might influence those who come after us. Consider Jesus' words in Matthew 25:21. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Notice that the praise isn't for being spectacular or highly visible, but for being faithful with whatever was entrusted. This is exactly what we see in the legacy of Moses' sons, faithfulness that led to expanded influence and responsibility. The seeming disappearance of Moses' sons from the main biblical narrative wasn't a sign of divine displeasure or punishment. Instead, it was part of God's intentional design to show us that His purposes often unfold in ways we don't expect. Their story teaches us that sometimes what looks like being overlooked is actually being positioned for a different kind of impact. Remember what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4:2. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. Not famous, not spectacular, not highly visible, just faithful. This was the legacy of Moses' sons, and it can be our legacy too. Every act of faithful service, whether seen or unseen, becomes part of God's greater work in the world. So what appeared to be a mystery, the seeming disappearance of Moses' sons from prominence, turns out to be a powerful revelation of how God often works. Their story wasn't one of failure or divine oversight, but of purposeful positioning for a different kind of impact. They remind us that God's greatest work in our lives might not be in making us famous, but in making us faithful. There are no small roles in God's kingdom, only small thinking about the roles God assigns. Whether you're leading from the front or serving behind the scenes, your faithfulness matters. Your service counts. Your role, however hidden it might seem, is essential to God's greater purpose. The sons of Moses weren't erased from history. They were embedded into a legacy of faithful service that continues to teach us today. Their story challenges us to redefine success, to embrace our assigned roles with joy, and to trust that God's purpose for our lives might look different from what we expected but is no less significant. The next time you feel overlooked or wonder if your service matters, remember Gershom and Eliezer. Remember how God used their seemingly quiet lives to establish a legacy of faithful service that impacted generations. Remember that in God's kingdom, greatness isn't measured by visibility, but by faithfulness. And remember that your story, like theirs, is part of a greater narrative that God is writing across generations. Their legacy lives on not in monuments or grand achievements, but in the truth that every role in God's kingdom matters. Every act of faithful service counts. Every life surrendered to God's purpose, whether in the spotlight or behind the scenes, becomes part of His greater work in the world. This is the true legacy of Moses' sons. Not a story of disappearance, but a testimony to the power of faithful service in God's perfect plan. May this hidden story from Scripture encourage you to embrace your unique role in God's kingdom, knowing that faithful service, however unseen, is never unimportant. For in God's economy, it's not the size of the role that matters, but the faithfulness with which we fulfill it.